In 1851, at the Great Exhibition in London, thousands of people crowded around a small wooden box. Inside the box was a lock. An American locksmith named Alfred Hobbs stood before it, manipulating a small metal tool. He was picking the unpickable lock of the British Empire. The crowd held its breath. For decades, this lock had guarded the wealth of nations. It was considered the ultimate symbol of security. But in a matter of minutes, Hobbs opened it. The mechanical promise of an empire collapsed. But the true story of the lock did not begin in Victorian London. It began 4,000 years earlier, when humanity needed to invent a word. The word was mine. And to guarantee that something was mine, we had to invent the most decisive object in the history of civilization, the lock. Long before the concept of banks, humans lived in open, communal spaces. Belongings were shared. The idea of personal ownership did not exist. But as agriculture took root, the concept of surplus was born. Grain, livestock, valuables. The idea of ownership slowly crept into the human mind. And with ownership came a new, dark emotion. The fear of losing what was yours. Archaeological evidence points to ancient Mesopotamia, nearly 4,000 years ago, where the first rudimentary barriers were used to protect grain stores. But it was in ancient Egypt that the lock became a marvel of engineering. The Egyptians did not have steel, they did not have precision tools. What they had was wood, patience, and a deep understanding of physics. They invented the pin tumbler lock. It was a massive wooden device, often reaching 2 feet in length. It operated on a brilliant principle. A hollowed-out wooden bolt had vertical holes drilled into it. Into these holes dropped wooden pins. When the bolt was pushed forward, the pins fell into place, locking it securely. To open it, you needed a key. But not just any key. A wooden key that looked like a large toothbrush with pegs extending from it. You would insert the key into the bolt, lift the wooden pins to the exact height to clear the obstruction, and pull the bolt back. The genius of this system is staggering. They did not know the word mechanics. They did not know the word engineering. They built it anyway. And here is the part that takes people by surprise. If you look at the front door of your house right now, the fundamental mechanism inside your lock is almost identical to that Egyptian wooden device. The pin tumbler is still the global standard. The Egyptians used these massive wooden locks to protect their temples and their pharaohs. It was an era of immense wealth, guarded by simple wooden pins. But those pins were about to do more than just protect grain. They were about to secure the power of empires. And the next civilization to take this design would turn it into an instrument of absolute control. The Roman Empire did not just conquer territory. It conquered wealth. And to manage wealth on a scale the world had never seen, Rome needed security. The Romans took the Egyptian wooden pin tumbler and upgraded it. They introduced iron. They introduced the warded lock. In a warded lock, a series of obstructions, or wards, are placed inside the lock casing. The key has to be cut exactly to bypass these wards and turn the bolt. It was cheaper to produce. It was easier to mass manufacture. And for an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, mass manufacturing was everything. Roman blacksmiths were churning out iron locks for homes, military armories, and government treasuries. Locks became so common that they transformed into a status symbol. The size and complexity of your lock announced your wealth to the world. Wealthy Roman matrons would carry their keys on their fingers, wearing them as massive, conspicuous rings. It was a clear and loud message. I have things worth locking up. The Romans even developed the first master key systems, allowing administrators to access multiple rooms while slaves could only access their designated quarters. It was an architectural hierarchy, enforced by metal. The poet Horace once complained about the burden of carrying heavy keys, a sign that security had become a daily chore for the elite. Rome built its economy on locked chests, locked granaries, and locked armories. But as the empire expanded, it started running out of things to lock up. They needed more. And they would send explorers to the edges of the known world to find it. This search for wealth would eventually collide with a different kind of society, one that had no concept of locks at all. and that collision would change the meaning of the word mine forever. When European ships arrived on the shores of the Americas, they brought cannons, diseases, and Bibles. But they also brought something else: iron locks. To the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the concept of a lock was entirely foreign. Land was not owned. Water was not owned. Resources were shared among the tribe. The idea that you could put a piece of metal on a wooden door and declare that what was inside belonged to one person was completely absurd. The Europeans did not just bring locks. They brought the entire philosophy of private property, enforced by metal. When colonists arrived, they immediately began building fences and putting padlocks on gates. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The lock became the physical manifestation of a legal system the native population could not comprehend. You fence off a field, you put a lock on the gate, and suddenly that land is yours. The concept of owning the earth itself was alien, but the lock made it real. The colonists brought their strongboxes, secured with heavy iron-warded locks, to hold the gold and silver they extracted. They locked away the deeds to the land they claimed. The lock transformed from a tool of personal protection into a weapon of systemic conquest. It was a one-way street. The Europeans locked their wealth away from the people whose land it had been taken from. The indigenous populations had no locks to protect their own world. The metal mechanism that kept a Roman matron's jewelry safe was now drawing borders across continents. But as the new world was being carved up by fences and padlocks, the old world was growing paranoid. The locks were not strong enough. Thieves were getting smarter, and the lock was about to enter its darkest age. During the Middle Ages, the lock took on a strange, almost mystical aura. In a world governed by superstition, a small metal device that could defy a thief was sometimes seen as witchcraft. Locksmiths were viewed with a mixture of awe and deep suspicion. They were men who understood the dark arts of metal and mechanism. In some European villages, a locksmith who made a lock that could not be picked was rumored to have made a pact with the devil. The Catholic Church even adopted the symbolism of the key. St. Peter held the keys to heaven. The lock was no longer just a physical object. It was a spiritual gatekeeper. But the fear was not just of witchcraft. It was of each other. As cities grew, poverty and crime soared. The lock became the only thing standing between a family and starvation. People began hiding their locks. They would build secret doors, false walls, and trapdoors. The lock was not displayed as a status symbol anymore, like in Rome. It was hidden away in shame and fear. Locksmith guilds became incredibly powerful. They guarded their secrets with blood oaths. If a locksmith discovered a way to pick a competitor's lock, he was forbidden from revealing it, forcing the public to live in a constant state of vulnerability. The blacksmiths held a monopoly on security. They decided who was safe and who was not. It was an era of paranoia. And into this world of fear stepped a new breed of criminal, the professional lockpicker. The battle between the lockmaker and the lockbreaker was about to become a public obsession, and it would push the lock to its absolute physical limits. But first, the lock would be used to hide one of the darkest secrets in human history. And here is where the history gets dark. The wealth of the modern world was not built just on locked land. It was built on locked human beings. During the transatlantic slave trade, the lock was a tool of unimaginable horror. When millions of Africans were forced onto ships, they were shackled with heavy iron collars and padlocks. The same mechanical principle that protected grain in Egypt was now used to cage human beings in the pitch black of a ship's hull. Slave merchants used massive iron locks on the doors of the cargo holds. These locks did not protect property. They created property. By locking a human being, you reduced them to a commodity. A piece of flesh that could be owned, sold, and inherited. The profits from this locked cargo were carried back to Europe and placed inside strongboxes. Safes with complex combination locks, hidden behind wooden panels. The wealth of empires was literally locked away, sanitized by brass and steel. The lock was the silent enabler of the greatest crime in history. It kept the victims trapped. It kept the profits hidden. It kept the conscience of the buyers clean. But the Industrial Revolution was coming. and with it, a new class of wealth. A middle class that wanted their own locks. The demand for security exploded, and the locksmiths realized they needed to evolve. The simple warded lock of the Romans was no match for the professional thieves of London. The lock needed a miracle, and it got one. A mechanic named Robert Barron walked into a workshop and changed the game forever. He invented the double-acting tumbler lock. For the first time in history, if a pin was lifted too high, the lock would not open. It was a mathematical wall, but the world was not ready for what came next. If you are finding this history interesting, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Here at Common Lore, we tell stories like this every single week, and you are not going to want to miss what comes next. By the early 19th century, London was the wealthiest city on earth, and it was terrified. The Bank of England was practically held hostage by its own fear of being robbed. The lock was the only defense. Two names dominated the era: Jeremiah Chubb and Joseph Bramah. Chubb invented a lock that would jam if someone tried to pick it, alerting the owner to the intrusion. Bramah created a lock with an incredibly complex key, boasting a mathematical impossibility of being picked. The public was obsessed. The government offered huge rewards to anyone who could pick these locks. It was the ultimate duel, the lockmakers versus the underworld. And then came the Great Exhibition of 1851. An American locksmith named Alfred Hobbs walked into the Crystal Palace. He walked up to the Bramah lock, which had remained unpicked for over 40 years, and he picked it. In front of the world. It took him 51 hours over 16 days, but he did it. He then picked the Chubb lock. The British were stunned. Their sense of security, built on metal and pride, was shattered. The lock industry panicked. If the American could pick the unpickable, what was the point of a lock? The truth was, the lock had finally evolved into a psychological weapon. The goal was no longer to make it impossible to open. The goal was to make it take so long that the thief would give up or be caught. This realization reshaped the banking industry. It reshaped insurance. It reshaped the modern economy. The lock was no longer just keeping people out. It was buying time. But it was about to become invisible. The Panic of 1851 forced the lock into the modern age. And the man who brought it there was an American named Linus Yale Jr. Yale looked back at the ancient Egyptian wooden pin tumbler. He realized the core design was perfect. It just needed modern materials. He miniaturized it. He made it out of brass and steel. He invented the flat key, the small serrated piece of metal you carry in your pocket today. The Yale lock was cheap, mass-produced, and highly effective. It was the Model T of security. Suddenly, everyone could afford a lock. The lock went from a luxury of the elite to a basic human necessity. Today, the scale is staggering. Billions of locks are manufactured every year. The United States alone has over 150 million residential doors, and almost all of them use a variation of the Yale cylinder. But locks are not just for doors anymore. They are everywhere. Combination locks secure lockers in schools. Padlocks secure shipping containers carrying goods across the ocean. And here is the part that takes people by surprise. Locks are in space. The International Space Station uses specialized locks to secure equipment in zero gravity. Locks are in cyberspace. Cryptography, the encryption that protects your bank account and your private messages, is essentially a digital lock. The algorithms are just modern versions of the wooden pins in ancient Egypt. We have replaced brass and steel with ones and zeros. But the principle remains exactly the same. You have something, you want to keep it. You lock it. The digital lock is just the latest evolution of a 4,000-year-old idea. But what has the lock actually done to us as a species? Look at your front door. Look at the lock. It is a small piece of brass. It is cold to the touch, but it represents the most fundamental shift in human history. It was ignored. It was feared. It secured the wealth of empires. It enabled the darkest crimes. It started as a wooden device in Egypt to protect grain. It ended as a digital algorithm protecting your identity. We started as a species that shared everything. We built fires together. We hunted together. We lived in open spaces. But the moment we had a surplus, the moment we had a little more than we needed, we invented the lock. And the lock invented the concept of mine. The lock drew a line in the sand. On one side, you. On the other side, everyone else. The lock did not just protect our property, it isolated us. Every time you turn your key, you are participating in a 4,000-year-old ritual of separation. You are locking out the world. The lock is the physical manifestation of human distrust. We needed it to survive. We needed it to build civilization. But we paid a price. We traded community for security. We traded open doors for walled gardens. And that is the true history of the lock. It is not the history of metal. It is the history of the human mind. The lock is the boundary of our trust, and we check it every night before we go to sleep. If this story surprised you, subscribe to Common Law and tell us in the comments which part of the history of the lock surprised you the most. And leave your like so that more people can find this video.